Chair recognizes Ms. Johnson of Dallas to speak against the resolution.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, I rise in vehement opposition to this resolution allowing the out of bounds on this bill. Governor Abbott's appointed Secretary of State herself said several times that the 2020 election in Texas was safe, successful, and secure. Despite that, national figures perpetuated the big lie about the recent election, causing a flurry of pandering actions. A desperate search by our Attorney General, coupled with a bounty of $1 million by our Lieutenant Governor, produced no founded cases of election fraud in the 2020 election. This bill and the accompanying abusive process that came with creating this discriminatory legislation has been highly irregular, and that's putting it mildly. The Conference Committee has added a provision regarding overturning an election that is truly undemocratic and offensive to the rule of law. It says that the court may declare the election void without attempting to determine how individuals actually voted. This provision allows a lawsuit to overturn an election without having to prove that the fraud actually occurred. Just think about that. Your election can be overturned without the other side being required to prove actual voter fraud. Additionally, the provision lowers the burden of proof to overturn an election. In other words, this election challenger is no longer required to show that fraudulent votes actually resulted in a win. The implications of this are unthinkable. To make matters worse, the provision was not in either the Senate nor the House version of the bill. This provision has not been subject to review and debate by the public. This provision has not been subject to review and debate by this body, and the provision has not seen the light of day until the last hours of yesterday. The purpose of the legislative process has been completely subverted by adding a terrible provision under the cover of darkness. What has happened to process? What has happened to the rules that this body is supposed to care about? We have rules and processes in order to have a just society so that people can have faith and confidence in the laws that govern them. Democracies are based on the rule of law whose formation are based on an open debate and participation and whose enforcement are based on true facts and fairness. When these principles fail, our foundation crumbles into autocracy, dictatorship, and tyranny. Why are we here if we're not going to insist that we have an opportunity to debate and be heard on important legislation? Make no mistake, the state of Texas will go to court again for this bill. We will waste millions of taxpayer dollars again defending this awful piece of legislation that seeks to disenfranchise so many Texas voters. This state has decided again to forego protecting voters' rights and straight to restricting them. And this is truly a sad day for the rule of law and the very foundations upon which our democracy rests. Thank you.
Mr. Turner, for what purpose?
Will the gentlelady yield for
Will the lady
questions?
yield for questions?
Yes.
She yields.
Thank you, Representative Johnson. As I look at this resolution before us, and I know we've all been incredibly busy over the last several days considering really bill after bill and conference committee report after conference committee report, and I find it sometimes difficult to keep up with everything, yet as you have pointed out, we are all confronted here with a very lengthy report and a very lengthy resolution that frankly has been difficult for me to fully digest in the time we've had. You've mentioned several provisions already and others have too. Do you feel that you have been able to adequately understand all of this new material that's being presented to us on very nearly the last day of the session?
No, it's been very difficult. When you get at the bill is 60-something pages long. And when you get, at the very last hour, an additional resolution that's 20 pages long of new provisions and new materials that has never been before presented to this body, the Texas House of Representatives, to debate on behalf of all of our constituents, it's unconscionable. And it's unconscionable that we are actually sitting here doing this as opposed to rejecting this move by the Senate saying, no, we the House deserve to debate and we're going to honor those rules.
You know, as I read the resolution, I'm seeing things that I guess are really going to affect large numbers of Texans in the voting and electoral process. There are brand new requirements for anyone who wants to vote by mail, for instance, that are in this resolution before us. And if I understand all this correctly, these are new provisions that have not been a part of this bill during the duration of its passage through the legislature, through the House, the Senate, the committee process up until now. Is that your understanding as well?
That is exactly my understanding, sir.
I see, you know, for instance, there are going to be new requirements that a person is going to have to place on the outside of an application to vote early. There are new requirements related to what kind of disability is going to qualify for a person that wants to vote by mail on the basis of disability. Would you agree with me that those are exactly the kind of things that really deserve some detailed scrutiny in our legislative process and not the kind of thing that should be added at the last minute?
Well, exactly. You know, the right to vote is the most fundamental piece of our democracy. And this body should be looking for ways to expand everyone's opportunity to vote. We should be having online voter registration. We should have all kinds of opportunities. I do not understand for the life of me why we want to restrict people from mail-in ballot voting. This affects our seniors, this affects our disabled, this affects pregnant women, this affects all women with young kids who may not be able to take their children to go vote with them. And I just do not understand why this body and this legislature is trying to make it so hard for these families to go and cast their God-given right to vote in this country.
I feel, Representative Johnson, as I read some of these provisions, some of them I just don't fully understand exactly what they mean. And, you know, maybe I have time to ask a question or two here briefly in the few remaining hours or minutes we have, but it's definitely the sort of thing where I'd like to have had the opportunity to really study and consult with others that have read this carefully and could give me an opinion. And one example here on page 9 of this resolution, it talks about an application to vote by mail. I believe this refers to an application to vote by mail. On line 20, it says it must be submitted in writing and signed by the applicant using ink on paper. No longer possible to use an electronic signature or photocopied signature. But as I read that, I actually don't understand if that means only the signature must be in ink or the entire application must be in ink. Do you know the answer to that?
I do not. It's a vague question. You're right. Do you have the ability to fill in the blanks and print the application and just hand sign it, or are you required to hand write in the entire application? It's vague on this piece of paper. You and I are both attorneys. We also understand that words matter and precision matters. And this is the kind of thing that's vague. It causes confusion. If you're at home and you're trying to figure out what to do and you're trying to print a ballot, and if somebody thinks they're being great so that it can be legible and not confusing based on your handwriting, and they print it, is their ballot going to be thrown out? It's hard to tell based on this bill.
Well, and it's just one example and one small provision, but I guess the point that I'm trying to make is there are many of those in this resolution and many of those in the conference committee report that went outside the bounds, and that's what we have in front of us. Explicitly material that goes outside of anything else considered in this legislative session so far. And so I appreciate your comments about this, Representative Johnson.
Thank you, sir.
Mr. Speaker, will the gentlelady yield, sir?
Lady
Got
for
people
questions.
running both ways.
She yields for questions.
Thank
Yes.
you. Thank you, Ms. Representative Johnson. Unlike you, I am not a lawyer, but I am highly offended that we are going to make laws without completely vetting them. How is this going to play out in the courtrooms, do you think?
Well, I mean, like I said, there's going to be a lot of aspects of this bill that's litigated. There's a lot of issues that are, in my opinion, discriminatory, unconstitutional, and then there's vague and ambiguous languages. There's multiple bases by which this bill is going to be challenged in court, and that's going to be at the cost of taxpayers. And unfortunately, that is that we're not going to be able to fund really key programs that the people of Texas want, like healthcare and many other issues, because those monies are being spent on wasteful litigation because we are passing a terrible bill.
And maybe a history class or two about elections and maybe the 1965 voter protection.
And maybe a history class or two about elections.
Yes,
That's correct.
Thank you. So I think that everybody should be concerned, but I'm also concerned that we're just going to vote on this on party lines, and there are people in this body who are not paying attention and don't seem to care. Would you agree?
I think, I think people in this body care, but it's disheartening how many people will come up to you privately and say, this is a bad bill for my constituents, but yet won't come to the mic and say so.
Ladies, time's expired.